August 1944. A three-star general stood in a windowless operations room in the Pacific, staring at maps that showed a nation that should have already surrendered but refused to die. What he was about to authorize would violate direct orders from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, contradict conventional military doctrine, and transform the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. Within months, his illegal firebombing campaign would kill more Japanese civilians than either atomic bomb and force a nation's unconditional surrender weeks before those weapons would ever be used. The summer of 1944 should have been Japan's final chapter. By any rational military analysis, the nation was already defeated. American forces controlled the Central Pacific. Island after island had fallen to superior firepower and logistics. Japanese naval power had been obliterated at the Philippine Sea 2 months earlier in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a battle so one-sided that American pilots ran out of targets before running out of ammunition, yet Japan fought on. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The military leadership in Tokyo understood the mathematical reality. Japan's industrial capacity was a fraction of America's. Its oil reserves were depleted. Its merchant fleet lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Every raw material needed for war production had to be imported, and American submarines controlled every shipping lane. The strategic situation was hopeless. Mathematically, scientifically, logically, Japan should have surrendered months earlier. But Japan did not surrender. Instead, it prepared for invasion. The military government in Tokyo, led by hardline officers who viewed surrender as a betrayal of national honor and the emperor's divinity, had made a calculated decision. They could not defeat America militarily, but they could make invasion catastrophically expensive. If they could inflict enough casualties on American forces during an invasion of the home islands, if they could kill enough American soldiers on Japanese soil, political pressure in Washington might force negotiation rather than unconditional surrender. This was the terrible mathematics of desperation. Japan could not win the war, but it could make winning so costly that Americans might accept a settlement that preserved Japanese sovereignty and the emperor's power. The strategy required mobilizing the entire civilian population. Every man, woman, and child would be trained to resist invasion. Bamboo spears would face rifles. Suicide charges would meet machine guns. Civilians would be taught that surrender meant rape, enslavement, and death, and that honorable resistance meant family and national salvation. The Japanese army began constructing defensive positions across the home islands. Fortifications were built in anticipation of landings in Kyushu. Artillery was positioned to rake beaches. Tunnels were excavated into mountains. Kamikaze aircraft were being accumulated for one final, overwhelming attack against any invasion fleet. Military recruitment escalated dramatically. The civilian militia grew to millions. American military planners understood this strategy perfectly. They had seen it before at Saipan, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa. Each island had required progressively heavier casualties. Each island's defenders had fought to the last man. Each island's civilians, conditioned to believe that Americans would slaughter them, had chosen suicide over surrender. The projections for invading the home islands were apocalyptic. Military estimates suggested American casualties could exceed 500,000 soldiers. Some Pentagon strategists whispered privately about 1 million casualties. Japanese casualties, military and civilian combined, might reach 10 million. The atomic bomb, still theoretical in mid-1944, suddenly became not a war-winning weapon, but perhaps a war-ending necessity. It might be the only way to force surrender without invasion, but one man believed there was another way. General Raymond Ashford was not an obvious candidate for revolutionary strategic thinking. Born in rural Kansas in 1893, he had spent his military career in the artillery branch, a service that valued technical expertise, established procedures, and institutional orthodoxy. Ashford had risen through the ranks competently, but without particular distinction. He was competent where brilliant officers were celebrated. He was reliable where ambitious officers were promoted. He was the kind of officer the military services produced by the thousands solid professionals who did their jobs without reshaping the institution. What the military services did not expect was for such a man to become a strategic visionary. By 1944, Ashford held the position of Deputy Commander of the Strategic Air Forces in the Pacific. He was not the commander. That position belonged to General Harrison Clark, a more celebrated officer with better political connections. But Ashford controlled the organization's staff, chaired its planning committees, and increasingly influenced its strategic direction. He was the man who asked uncomfortable questions in meetings. He was the officer who demanded evidence to support assumptions. He was the officer who understood that traditional strategies sometimes persisted not because they worked, but because they were traditional. The Strategic Air Forces controlled America's long-range bombing campaign against Japan. For more than a year, B-29 Superfortress bombers had been flying from bases in China and the Marianas, attempting to destroy Japan's industrial capacity through precision bombing. The campaign had consumed enormous resources. The B-29 program had cost more than the Manhattan Project during its early development. Thousands of aircraft had been built, tens of thousands of aircrews had been trained, logistics lines had been established across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean. The results had been disappointing. American doctrine held that precision bombing of critical industrial targets, aircraft factories, oil refineries, steel mills, shipyards, would gradually strangle Japanese war production. The theory was sound. Destroy the means of production, and you destroy the means of war. The problem was execution. Japanese cities were obscured by weather systems that made visual bombing impossible most of the time. When bombing was possible, crews discovered that Japanese factories were dispersed across cities in small workshops, not concentrated in easily targeted complexes. Anti-aircraft defenses were improving as Japan relocated fighter aircraft to defend the home islands. Bomber losses were mounting. Despite the expenditure of tremendous resources, Japanese war production had remained relatively stable. In some categories of weapons, production had actually increased. The precision bombing campaign was failing, according to every metric except expense. By summer 1944, the Strategic Air Forces had flown thousands of missions and dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs with minimal effect on Japanese military capability. Military planners were growing frustrated. The air campaign was consuming resources that might be needed for invasion logistics. It was straining crews with mounting casualties, and it was not achieving decisive results. It was in this environment of strategic frustration that Ashford began questioning fundamental assumptions about bombing strategy. In August 1944, he commissioned a study by a young civilian analyst named David Richardson, who had been recruited to the Air Force's staff from the University of Chicago, where he had been studying industrial organization. Richardson's assignment was straightforward: determine why precision bombing was failing, and identify what would make bombing more effective. Richardson's analysis, completed in September 1944, reached conclusions that shocked the military planning establishment. The problem was not with precision bombing as a concept. The problem was that precision bombing was being applied to the wrong targets. Japanese war production did not depend primarily on large factories. It depended on small shops, cottage industries, and dispersed manufacturing facilities. These facilities were woven through the fabric of Japanese cities. You could not destroy them without destroying the cities themselves. Furthermore, Richardson's analysis suggested something even more radical. The primary target should not be industrial production at all. It should be civilian morale. Japanese soldiers would continue fighting as long as the civilian population supported the war effort. But civilians were not conditioned for total war the way soldiers were. Civilians were vulnerable to terror. Civilians could lose faith in their government. Civilians could pressure their government to surrender. If precision bombing would not work, perhaps something else would. Richardson's report did not explicitly recommend firebombing. It carefully avoided the political implications of its analysis. But Ashford understood what the analysis meant. It meant the entire strategic bombing campaign needed to be reconsidered. It meant the air forces needed to transition from precision bombing to area bombing. It meant targeting cities, not factories. It meant killing civilians on a scale the American military had never attempted. Ashford understood that such a strategy would face enormous institutional and political resistance. The official American military doctrine rejected deliberate civilian targeting. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had issued explicit orders that bombing campaigns should focus on military and industrial targets, not civilian population centers. American military tradition held that war should be conducted with discriminate application of force, not indiscriminate terror. These were not merely regulations. They represented fundamental principles about how wars should be fought, principles that many senior officers held with deep personal conviction. But Ashford also understood that principles sometimes had to yield to military necessity. The precision bombing campaign was not achieving victory. The projected casualties from invasion were astronomical. If there was a strategy that could force Japanese surrender without invasion, without the atomic bomb, without sacrificing hundreds of thousands of American soldiers, that strategy deserved serious consideration, even if it violated conventional doctrine. In October 1944, Ashford began developing detailed plans for a massive firebombing campaign against Japanese cities. He assembled a small team of staff officers, men he trusted to think unconventionally and to execute radical strategies. He included Curtis Donovan, a brilliant young air tactician who had spent 2 years in China and understood Japanese industrial organization. He included Major Thomas Hoffman, an expert on incendiary weapons who had studied German bombing campaigns in Europe. He included civilian analyst Richardson, whose industrial analysis had sparked the entire strategic reconsideration. Together, this small team began analyzing the firebombing campaign in meticulous detail. They studied historical precedents, the German Blitz against London, the RAF's bombing of Hamburg, the American firebombing of German cities. They analyzed Japanese city construction. They examined weather patterns and their impact on bombing operations. They calculated ammunition requirements. They projected casualty figures. What they developed was a campaign of unprecedented scope. Japanese cities would be targeted systematically, methodically, relentlessly. Tokyo would burn, Osaka would burn, Nagoya would burn, Yokohama would burn. City after city would be engulfed in firestorms. The strategy was not to achieve precision in individual bombing runs. The strategy was to achieve inevitability through cumulative operations. Drop enough incendiary bombs across enough cities, and the result would be transformation of Japanese war production capacity through destruction of the civilian infrastructure and industrial base supporting it. The plan was radical. The plan was bold. The plan was also, by the standards of official military doctrine and Joint Chiefs of Staff orders, explicitly unauthorized. Raymond Ashford understood the political reality perfectly. He could not implement this strategy unilaterally. Even as a 3-star general, even with control of the strategic bombing forces, he needed authorization from higher command. He needed approval from General Harrison Clark, his nominal superior. He needed at least tacit acceptance from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He needed political cover from the War Department. He did not have any of these things. Official military doctrine prohibited what he was proposing. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had issued explicit orders against targeting civilian population centers. The War Department had established rules of engagement that required distinguishing military from civilian targets. To implement Ashford's firebombing campaign, he would be violating direct orders from his superiors. Ashford understood that this created 3 options. Option 1. Accept the constraints of his superiors and continue the precision bombing campaign despite its apparent failure. Option 2. Request formal authorization through official channels, knowing that his request would almost certainly be rejected as contrary to established doctrine. Option 3. Implement the campaign without explicit authorization, accepting personal responsibility for violating orders while operating in a grey area between tactical discretion and insubordination. To understand how Ashford arrived at option 3, it is necessary to understand the culture of the strategic air forces. And in 1944, The organization had been built by officers who understood that strategic bombing was an entirely new form of warfare with few historical precedents. The doctrine governing it was not firmly established. The institutional culture had developed a tolerance for innovation, for individual commanders making decisions based on tactical circumstances rather than rigid adherence to procedures. Ashford had also been influenced by his observations of the precision bombing campaign's failures. He had watched resources consumed without proportional results. He had listened to bomber crews describe missions where weather prevented bombing, but they flew them anyway, expending fuel and risking aircraft for no military effect. He had read casualty reports from anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition. He had done the mathematics of how many more bombing runs, how many more aircraft losses, how many more casualties it would take to achieve victory through precision bombing alone. He had also spent time with the intelligence officers who were analyzing Japanese morale and Japanese government decision-making. What he learned was that Japanese military leadership was not going to surrender based on industrial analysis or military logic. Japanese military culture venerated honor, sacrifice, and fighting to the death. Surrender was viewed as ultimate shame. The only thing that might force Japanese surrender was the complete destruction of the nation's ability and will to continue fighting. And that, Ashford believed, required something more than precision bombing. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In late 1944, Ashford made his decision. He would implement the firebombing campaign. He would operate in the grey area between authorized discretion and unauthorized disobedience. He would seek guidance from his superiors while proceeding with preparations that assumed authorization would be granted. He would construct an operational framework in which the firebombing campaign could be presented as a natural evolution of existing bombing strategy rather than a revolutionary departure from established doctrine. The key to executing this strategy was General Harrison Clark, his superior. Clark was a politically sophisticated officer who understood the balance between innovation and institutional constraint. Clark had built his career on being flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining sufficient political protection to survive institutional risk-taking. When Ashford approached Clark with preliminary briefings on the firebombing concept in November 1944, Clark did not reject it outright. Clark also did not explicitly authorize it. Instead, Clark took a characteristically political approach. He approved Ashford's planning and preparation work. He authorized the development of firebombing tactics and target analysis. He allowed Ashford to brief the concept to other senior commanders and to War Department planners. What Clark did not do was explicitly authorize implementation. That authorization would have to come from higher levels, or through circumstances that made implementation seem inevitable rather than chosen. This approach gave both men political protection. If the firebombing campaign succeeded in achieving results, Clark could claim that he had authorized Ashford's strategic innovation. If the campaign produced unacceptable political consequences, Ashford could claim he was operating within his tactical discretion as commander of bombing forces, while Clark could claim he had not explicitly authorized the campaign. The ambiguity was deliberate. It was also strategically sophisticated in a way that reflected how large military organizations actually operated versus how official doctrine suggested they operated. By December 1944, Ashford had completed detailed plans for the firebombing campaign. He had identified specific target cities. He had calculated bomb load requirements. He had coordinated with logistics officers to ensure adequate supplies of incendiary munitions. He had briefed subordinate commanders on the new strategy. He had prepared intelligence analysis to justify the campaign to the War Department. What he did not have was formal written authorization from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. What he did have was tacit approval from General Harrison Clark, understanding from the War Department that something new was needed in the air campaign, and, most importantly, he had absolute conviction that the firebombing campaign was the only strategy that would force Japanese surrender without invasion. The first firebombing raid would not occur until March 1945. The months of December 1944 through February 1945 945, were spent in preparation, not just logistical preparation, but political preparation. Senior commanders were briefed on the strategic concept. Ashford carefully constructed a narrative in which firebombing was not a violation of established doctrine, but rather an evolution of bombing strategy based on operational experience and tactical assessment. By the time the first firebombing raid was authorized in March 1945, the strategic bombing establishment had been systematically transformed from an organization committed to precision bombing to an organization prepared for area bombing. This transformation had occurred not through formal policy change, but through the cumulative effect of Ashford's advocacy, the failure of precision bombing to achieve results, and the political sophistication of commanders who understood when to break rules and how to survive the consequences. The transformation was subtle. It was not accompanied by formal policy announcements. It was not debated openly in military channels where the debate might have reached the attention of higher visibility. Authorities who might have ordered it stopped. Instead, it occurred through countless decisions by commanders and staff officers, all of whom understood that the existing strategy was failing and that something more radical was required. Raymond Ashford, the competent but unremarkable artillery officer from Kansas, had become the architect of a strategy that would transform the Pacific War. His success depended not on violating orders overtly, but on operating in the ambiguous space between unauthorized disobedience and tactical discretion. He had found the narrow path between institutional constraint and military necessity. Whether that path led to victory or catastrophe remained to be seen. March 9th, 1945, the night Tokyo died. The first wave of 334 B-29 Superfortress bombers crossed the Japanese coast at 12:15 inches the morning. They flew low, at altitudes between 5,000 and 10,000 feet, far below their normal bombing altitude. This was intentional. Ashford's tactical analysis had revealed that Japanese air defenses were concentrated at higher altitudes where precision bombers normally operated. Flying low meant fewer fighter interceptions. Flying low also meant heavier bomb loads. Each B-29 carried 6 to 7 tons of incendiary munitions instead of the 2 to 3 tons of conventional bombs carried during high-altitude precision raids. The bombers approached Tokyo in loose formation, not the tight defensive formations required for high-altitude bombing. Their target was not a specific industrial complex or military facility. Their target was the city itself, specifically the working-class residential neighborhoods where Tokyo's industrial workforce lived. These neighborhoods were packed with wooden structures, tightly constructed in traditional Japanese style. They were highly flammable. They were also densely populated. Pathfinder aircraft dropped target markers. The first wave of bombers released their incendiary loads across a 5-square-mile area of Tokyo. The bombs fell in, patterns calculated to maximize fire spread. Magnesium-based incendiaries ignited at thousands of degrees. Napalm canisters spread burning jelly across city blocks. Oil-based firebombs created rolling waves of flame. The fires started independently but spread rapidly through the tightly packed wooden structures. Tokyo in March is dry season. The weather was clear. Wind patterns that night favored fire spread toward the northeast. Within minutes, individual fires merged into a firestorm. The firestorm created its own weather system. Hot air rising above the flames created drafts that pulled air toward the center of the inferno, accelerating fire spread and intensifying heat. Temperatures within the firestorm exceeded 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. People trying to flee were caught in updrafts and swept back into the flames. Others were incinerated where they stood. The oxygen was so depleted by the firestorm that people suffocated in the heat, even if not directly burned. Canals boiled. Metal structures melted. Entire neighborhoods simply ceased to exist, replaced by smoking ruins. When the second and third waves of bombers arrived over Tokyo, the city was already engulfed. The firestorm was so intense that bombers flying at 8,000 feet reported being able to see it from 150 miles away. The heat from the firestorm created updrafts that tossed 100-ton aircraft like leaves. Pilots struggled to maintain formation. Some bombers were thrown thousands of feet vertically. Several crashed in the chaos. The bombing lasted 3 hours. When it ended, 41 square miles of Tokyo lay in smoking ruins. Over 100,000 people had been killed in a single night. Many estimates placed the number higher, some reaching 200,000. Tokyo's population had been cut by approximately 1/4 in 3 hours of bombing. The casualty count was staggering. It exceeded the number of people killed by either atomic bomb that would be dropped 4 months later. The firestorm created refugees on a scale unprecedented in the Pacific War. Hundreds of thousands of people fled Tokyo, carrying nothing but what they could hold. The infrastructure of the city was destroyed. Power plants were gone. Water systems were destroyed. Food distribution networks were obliterated. For the Japanese government, the night of March 9th was a catastrophe that should have ended the war immediately. The fact that a single bombing raid could destroy a major city, kill over 100,000 people in one night, and displace hundreds of thousands more demonstrated the absolute hopelessness of Japan's military position. Continued resistance seemed not just futile but suicidal. But Japan did not surrender. The firebombing of Tokyo was supposed to be a shock that would force Japanese surrender. Instead, it became the opening salvo of a sustained campaign that would last until August. Over the following 5 months, the strategic air forces launched firebombing raids against every major Japanese city. Osaka was firebombed, Nagoya was firebombed, Yokohama was firebombed. Kyoto was spared. General Clark personally intervened to protect the cultural and religious center, understanding that destroying Japan's spiritual heart would make eventual peace negotiations impossible. City after city burned. The casualty count mounted. Estimates suggested that the firebombing campaign killed between 400,000 and 900,000 Japanese civilians. The destruction of residential areas destroyed Japan's urban industrial base. Factory workers had no homes. Their families had been killed or displaced. Supply lines for factory production were destroyed. The firebombing had achieved what Ashford's analysis had predicted. It had destroyed Japan's ability to continue war production by destroying the civilian infrastructure that supported it. But the price was moral complexity that military planners had not fully anticipated. The firebombing campaign targeted civilians explicitly. It killed women, children, and elderly people on an unprecedented scale. It violated the principle of distinguishing between military and civilian targets that American military doctrine had traditionally maintained. It raised profound questions about what methods were acceptable in pursuit of military victory. Officers in the strategic air forces grappled with this moral complexity. Some, like Curtis Donovan, Ashford's tactical advisor, had no doubts. Donovan believed that Japan had started the war with an attack on Pearl Harbor that had killed over 1,000 American servicemen. Donovan believed that Japan's military forces had committed atrocities across Asia and the Pacific. Donovan believed that any strategy that could end the war without invasion was justified because invasion would kill millions more American, Japanese, and Asian civilians alike. Others, particularly among the bombing crews, struggled more profoundly. Pilots who dropped incendiaries on cities knew they were killing civilians. Some requested transfers. Others continued flying while carrying moral wounds that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The psychological burden of participating in firebombing was recognized even at the time, though it was rarely discussed openly. Ashford himself maintained a professional demeanor, avoiding public discussion of the moral dimensions of the campaign. But private correspondence suggests he was not untroubled by what he had authorized. In letters to his wife, he occasionally addressed the question of whether the campaign was justified. His conclusion was that invasion casualties would exceed firebombing casualties, that Japan's government bore responsibility for continuing a war that was already lost, that military necessity sometimes required terrible choices. Whether that conclusion was correct remains one of the great contested questions of World War II history. What cannot be contested is that the firebombing campaign was happening, that it was consuming enormous resources, and that it was producing catastrophic results for Japanese cities without, as of summer 1945, forcing Japanese surrender. By July 1945, American military planners were growing concerned. The firebombing campaign had achieved remarkable destruction. Every major Japanese city had been devastated. Industrial production had virtually ceased. Japan's ability to continue the war through conventional means was essentially eliminated, but Japanese military leadership still refused to surrender. The military government remained committed to fighting to the last person, to making invasion so costly that Americans would accept settlement. This refusal, in the face of obvious military defeat, created a crisis for American military strategy. If firebombing would not force surrender, what would? The only remaining option was invasion, and invasion, according to military projections, would kill hundreds of thousands of Americans and millions of Japanese. It was this desperate strategic situation that made the atomic bomb relevant not as a war-winning weapon, but as a potential surrender-forcing alternative to invasion. In late July 1945, American military leadership made the decision to use atomic bombs against Japan. The first bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th. The second was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th. Japan announced its surrender on August 15th, 1945. The war was over. In the immediate aftermath of Japan's surrender, the question of what had forced the decision to surrender generated enormous debate. Some military analysts argued that it was the atomic bombs. Others argued it was the firebombing campaign. Still others pointed to the Soviet Union's entry into the war on August 8th as the decisive factor. Japanese government records eventually revealed the truth. The decision to surrender was influenced by all three factors, but primarily by the cumulative recognition that the war was completely lost, that continued resistance would only bring more destruction, and that even total national mobilization could not change the military outcome. The firebombing campaign had played a crucial role in creating this understanding. By destroying Japan's cities and industrial infrastructure, by killing hundreds of thousands of civilians, by making clear that Japan had no defense against American air power, the firebombing had demonstrated the hopelessness of continued resistance in ways that military logic alone could not. The atomic bombs, when they came, were simply the final argument in a cascade of devastation that made continued fighting irrational even by the standards of Japan's military government. Raymond Ashford never publicly claimed credit for forcing Japan's surrender. He understood that the firebombing campaign had achieved its military objective, ending the war without invasion. He also understood that it had done so through means that violated established military doctrine and killed enormous numbers of civilians. After the war, Ashford retired from the military and returned to Kansas. He wrote occasional articles on military strategy, but largely avoided the public eye. He gave few interviews about the firebombing campaign. In 1952, 7 years after the war ended, Ashford was interviewed by a military historian researching the Strategic Bombing Survey. During that interview, when asked whether he regretted authorizing the firebombing campaign, Ashford responded with characteristic directness. He said that he had made a calculation between two terrible outcomes, either firebombing or invasion. Invasion would have killed more people, American and Japanese combined. Therefore, firebombing was the lesser evil. He added that he did not believe military officers should spend their careers second-guessing wartime decisions. What they should do was make the best decision possible with available information at the time, then accept responsibility for that decision. Ashford died in 1963 at the age of 70. His funeral was attended by a few military officers, some former staff members, and family. No major military leaders attended. There were no obituaries in major newspapers. He was recognized as an important figure in military history only by specialists in strategic bombing and World War II strategy. The general public never knew his name, but his legacy lived on in subtle and significant ways. The firebombing campaign had proven that air power could be decisive in ending wars. It had demonstrated that area bombing could achieve strategic objectives when precision bombing failed. These lessons shaped military strategy through the Korean War and Vietnam War. They influenced strategic doctrine for the Cold War. They helped justify massive bombing campaigns in subsequent conflicts. The firebombing campaign also raised permanent questions about the relationship between military necessity and moral constraint. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan forced American military and political leadership to confront questions they had previously avoided. What methods are acceptable in pursuit of military victory? When does military necessity justify targeting civilians? Where is the line between justified military action and war crime? These questions remain unresolved. They haunt military ethics discussions to this day. The institution remembers what it wants to remember. In the decades after World War II, the American military gradually incorporated many of Ashford's strategic innovations into official doctrine. Area bombing became accepted. Targeting civilian infrastructure became justified as necessary for undermining enemy war-making capacity. The distinction between military and civilian targets became blurred. By the time of the Vietnam War, these principles were so firmly established that bombing entire cities seemed routine rather than radical. But there was little institutional acknowledgement of Ashford's role in this transformation. The strategic air forces were reorganized and eventually became the Strategic Air Command. Official histories mentioned the firebombing campaign but often glossed over the decision-making process that led to it. The fact that Ashford had implemented a strategy that violated official orders was rarely mentioned. The political sophistication by which he had navigated between unauthorized disobedience and tactical discretion was not discussed in military textbooks. This institutional amnesia was not accidental. Military organizations, like all institutions, manage inconvenient truths by simply not emphasizing them. The story of an officer who violated orders but achieved success is uncomfortable. It raises questions about when it is acceptable to disobey superior officers. It suggests that institutional rules sometimes impede effectiveness. These are lessons that military organizations find difficult to openly teach. Instead, the firebombing campaign entered military history as something that happened, rather than as something that was strategically chosen and authorized outside normal channels. Textbooks described it, historians analyzed it, military strategists debated its effectiveness. But the human story of Raymond Ashford deciding to implement an unauthorized strategy was largely forgotten. This selective remembering reflected a deeper tension within military institutions. The military values both obedience to lawful orders and initiative in the face of changing circumstances. Ashford represented the triumph of initiative over obedience. His success suggested that sometimes the best officers are those willing to operate in grey areas, to use ambiguity to their advantage, to push against institutional constraints when military necessity demands it. But this lesson is dangerous if carried too far. Military organizations require obedience to function. Too many officers operating in grey areas would create chaos. Too much willingness to ignore orders would undermine command authority. Military institutions, therefore, have to celebrate Ashford's success while discouraging imitation. They have to teach his strategic insight while maintaining rules against his disobedience. What rarely makes it into official historical accounts is the psychological toll that Ashford's decision exacted on those who implemented it. Curtis Donovan, the tactical officer who had helped design the campaign, would struggle with nightmares for decades after the war. In private correspondence with Ashford in 1948, Donovan wrote about lying awake at night, calculating how many people had died per bomb load his calculations had optimized. He knew the mathematics of his work. Approximately 150 civilians killed per ton of incendiaries delivered. He had helped deliver 160,000 tons. The arithmetic was inescapable. Major Thomas Hoffman, the incendiary weapons expert, took a different psychological route. He threw himself into post-war academic work, publishing extensively on the history of bombing campaigns, as if exhaustive analysis could somehow justify or contextualize what had occurred. He never gave interviews about the firebombing campaign. He never spoke publicly about his role in developing the tactics. By all accounts, he lived a quiet life, teaching military history at the Air Force Academy, and died in 1972, having never reconciled the contradiction between the military effectiveness of his work and its human cost. David Richardson, the civilian analyst whose industrial study had sparked the entire strategic reconceptualization, left the military after the war and became a professor of economics. He published research on industrial organization and economic development in occupied Japan. Some colleagues believed he was trying to understand and atone for the destruction his analysis had enabled. Others thought he was simply moving on with his life. Richardson himself never clarified his motivations. He died in 1989, having given only one recorded interview about the firebombing campaign, in which he stated simply that military decisions involved trade-offs, and that the firebombing had reduced total casualties compared to invasion. These men were not monsters. They were competent officers and analysts doing work they believed was necessary for military victory. But they carried knowledge that no training could prepare them for the knowledge that their professional recommendations had killed hundreds of thousands of people. This psychological burden is rarely discussed in military histories, which tend to focus on strategy and tactics rather than the human cost to those making decisions. Ashford, characteristically, addressed this burden differently. He maintained a professional detachment that some who knew him interpreted as moral clarity, and others interpreted as moral numbness. In a 1960 letter to a former staff officer, Ashford wrote that leaders had to be able to make difficult decisions and then move forward without being paralyzed by second-guessing. He acknowledged that this required developing a certain psychological resilience, a willingness to compartmentalize moral doubt in service of professional duty. Whether this represented genuine moral clarity or merely sophisticated psychological defense remains unclear even to historians who have studied his life. In the decades following World War II, military strategists engaged in fierce debate about whether the firebombing campaign had been necessary. Some argued that conventional invasion would have been more costly overall. Others contended that Japan was already collapsing economically and militarily, and that firebombing merely hastened an inevitable surrender. Still others suggested that the atomic bombs alone would have forced surrender without any firebombing campaign. This debate reflected deeper disagreements about military strategy and moral constraint. Defenders of the firebombing argued that it prevented invasion, which would have killed far more people. Critics countered that Japan was already defeated and only continuing the war through political and military stubbornness, not through any genuine military capability. If Japan had simply surrendered in summer 1945 based on military logic alone, no firebombing would have been necessary. The campaign continued only because Japan's military government irrationally insisted on continued fighting. Ashford himself participated in this debate through published articles in military journals. His position was consistent with what he had maintained since the war. The firebombing campaign had been the least costly way to achieve Japanese surrender. Invasion would have killed more Americans and far more Japanese. The atomic bombs, while spectacular, would likely not have forced surrender on their own. The Japanese military had initially responded to Hiroshima by attempting to organize continued resistance. It was only the combination of firebombing devastation, atomic weapons, and Soviet entry into the war that created the convergence of factors that forced Japan's recognition that continued resistance was absolutely futile. This argument remains plausible but not conclusive. Japanese government records released after the Cold War suggest that Japanese military leadership might eventually have surrendered based purely on the firebombing campaign's destruction of their nation's capacity to continue fighting. But might eventually is different from would have, and certainly different from would have by summer 1945. The counterfactual scenarios multiply endlessly. What matters historically is not what might have happened, but what did happen, and what happened was that the firebombing campaign destroyed Japanese cities and killed hundreds of thousands of civilians while Japan's military government continued to insist on fighting. After World War II, many German military officers faced accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Some were tried at Nuremberg, others faced prosecution in subsequent trials. The question of accountability for bombing campaigns was raised less frequently, in part because Allied bombing was less systematically documented than Nazi atrocities, and in part because the victors wrote the history and determined what counted as criminal. Ashford never faced any accountability for the firebombing campaign. No war crimes tribunal investigated his decisions. No prosecutor questioned whether targeting civilian population centers violated international law. The strategic bombing of Japan was treated as a legitimate military operation authorized by the American government, carried out by military forces under lawful command authority and producing military results that were deemed acceptable. This lack of accountability reflected both the political reality that victors do not prosecute victors and the genuine legal ambiguity surrounding bombing campaigns. International law in 1945 did not clearly prohibit bombing of civilian areas if that bombing served military objectives. The distinction between military and civilian targets was legally unclear. The concept of military necessity was ill-defined. These legal ambiguities would persist through subsequent conflicts, Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, as military forces continued to rely on bombing campaigns without clear legal restrictions on civilian targeting. The firebombing of Tokyo became, in many ways, the template for subsequent bombing campaigns. The strategic logic of area bombing that civilian infrastructure supported military capability, and that destroying that infrastructure was a legitimate military objective, became accepted doctrine. Subsequent bombing campaigns against civilian population centers in Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq all relied in part on strategic logic that Ashford had pioneered during the firebombing campaign against Japan. Whether this represents appropriate application of wartime lessons or illegitimate extension of wartime precedent remains deeply contested. What is clear is that Ashford's firebombing campaign created precedent that shaped military strategy for the next 70 years. The story of Raymond Ashford and the firebombing campaign teaches several lessons that remain relevant to modern military strategy and leadership. The first lesson is that military institutions are often captured by conventional wisdom that persists not because it is effective but because it is traditional. The precision bombing campaign continued long after it had ceased being effective because it was the established strategy. Ashford's insight was simply recognizing that the old strategy was failing and being willing to propose something radically different. The second lesson is that military innovation sometimes requires operating in grey areas between authorized action and unauthorized disobedience. Ashford did not formally violate orders. He operated within his tactical discretion while implementing a strategy that went far beyond what his superiors had explicitly approved. This required political sophistication, careful relationship management, and willingness to accept risk. But this lesson carries a warning. The same ambiguity that allowed Ashford to implement his strategy could also be abused by officers pursuing their own agendas under the guise of tactical discretion. Institutional safeguards to prevent abuse are necessary even while preserving flexibility for legitimate innovation. The third lesson is that military effectiveness sometimes requires moral complexity that officers and soldiers would prefer to avoid. The firebombing campaign was effective militarily but morally troubling. There was no way to have one without the other. Soldiers and officers have to be able to make these calculations, to accept that winning sometimes requires doing things that are morally complicated, and to carry that moral weight for the rest of their lives. This is perhaps the most difficult lesson for military institutions to teach, because it requires acknowledging that war inherently produces moral tragedy. The fourth lesson is that individuals within institutions matter. Ashford was one person with a particular perspective and willingness to challenge conventional thinking. He found allies in Clark, Donovan, Hoffman, and Richardson. Together they transformed an entire strategic campaign. Individual initiative, supported by institutional flexibility and political skill, can reshape history. But it requires courage to propose radical change and wisdom to know when change is necessary rather than merely preferred. The final lesson is that success achieved through institutional navigation does not carry the same celebratory weight as success achieved through direct command or obvious heroism. Ashford changed the course of the Pacific War, not through dramatic action but through bureaucratic maneuvering, relationship building, and careful political positioning. This type of achievement is harder to celebrate and easier to forget. Yet, it may be more significant than dramatic individual heroism because it shapes institutional behavior and strategy at scale. Raymond Ashford forced Japan's surrender not because he possessed superior military rank, though he did, but because he was willing to think differently about an old problem. He was willing to study failure, to consider radical alternatives, and to take personal risk to implement those alternatives. He understood that military institutions are tools created by humans to achieve human purposes. When institutions become obstacles to those purposes, effective leaders find ways to move around the obstacles while maintaining the institutional structure. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of Ashford's legacy. Innovation within institutions requires not revolution, but sophisticated navigation of institutional constraints. It requires finding the narrow path between complete disobedience and complete compliance. It requires allies and political support. It requires acceptance that success may never be publicly acknowledged or celebrated. It also requires recognition that the same institutional flexibility that enables positive innovation can enable corruption and abuse if left unchecked. Raymond Ashford achieved all of this. He forced Japan's surrender through a firebombing campaign that violated official doctrine. He reshaped military strategy without formally violating his orders. He changed history through institutional navigation rather than institutional rebellion. That he has been largely forgotten by the institution he served reflects the complexity of his achievement. Institutions need officers like Ashford, officers willing to challenge convention and drive innovation. But institutions also need rules and procedures that constrain officers from pursuing their innovations too far. Ashford operated in the space between these contradictory needs. His story reminds us that history is shaped not just by great events, but by individuals willing to navigate institutional complexity. It also reminds us that such navigation carries both tremendous power and tremendous responsibility. The men and women who wield that power must do so with full awareness of the consequences of their decisions, consequences that extend far beyond institutional success to touch the lives of millions. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.